Senator James Paterson helped organise this global statement. He joins us now. Senator Paterson, welcome back to Breakfast.
Good morning, Fran.
These national security laws will be rubber-stamped this week by China's National People's Congress. The statement that you're a part of expresses grave concerns about China's bid to crack down. What are you concerned about? What's your concern about?
Well, there's two closely related issues here, Fran. One is that the National People's Congress is doing this at all. The very act of the National People's Congress passing legislation that governs Hong Kong in the area of national security in and of itself undermines the one country, two systems arrangement that Beijing agreed to in 1997 in the Sino-British declaration that handed over Hong Kong with a 50-year transition period. That's the first problem. The second problem is the content of the law itself. As you say, it goes to subversion, succession, collusion. It's essentially aimed at the pro-democratic movement within Hong Kong, and they are fearful that it will be used to criminalise their legitimate political activity, peaceful protest, freedom of speech, criticism of Beijing. And I think they've got very good reason for that belief, given the events that have happened in Hong Kong over the last year.
Yeah, well, China has been increasingly frustrated by those events, the pro-democracy movement, which has brought Hong Kong to a halt. What capacity or how do you think China will move to implement these laws? There is a Hong Kong Parliament, there is a Hong Kong security force. Is this going to override that Parliament? What do you fear is going to happen?
That's exactly what we fear, Fran, and the only reason why the National People's Congress is contemplating this legislation is because it's no longer possible for Beijing to use its allies and puppets in Hong Kong to pass it through the local legislature, because in their elections last year, pro-democracy candidates won a majority. Even under the difficult circumstances they were in, they still won a majority, and that meant that Beijing no longer had that rubber stamp. So while they might have previously tried to force this through the Hong Kong legislature, now they're just doing away with that pretense altogether and just going to pass it over the top.
And why now, do you think? China has been reluctant to act. I think there were signs it was mindful of the damage to its international reputation if it tried to take control of Hong Kong. Why do you think it's taking this aggressive action now? Is it banking on much of the world being distracted by the coronavirus crisis?
Well, I think there are two things happening here, Fran. One is, I think you're right, I fear that they're trying to slip this in under the shadow of COVID-19, hoping the rest of the world won't notice, or if it does notice, won't react as strongly as it did. And the other thing is, this National People's Congress was delayed. It was supposed to be happening earlier this year, and they may have always planned to do this at the National People's Congress, but because of COVID-19, it itself has been delayed.
Do you understand that China is going to put in another security force, actually a police force on the ground in Hong Kong as part of this?
Well, my friends in the pro-democracy movement have told me stories of Chinese agents already acting with impunity within the boundaries of Hong Kong for some period of time. I mean, we know that booksellers and other pro-democracy activists have been effectively rendered to the Chinese mainland, where they've disappeared and never been heard from again. They fear that will now be an open process, that Chinese police, rather than Hong Kong police, will be openly walking the streets of Hong Kong and effectively running Hong Kong.
The Australian government has made its feelings about this clear. It's signed on to a joint statement from Britain and Canada, I think, denouncing this move. There's also this joint declaration you've helped organise, which is not at government level, but it's politicians, and some of them very senior, from around 20 countries, which denies this and describes it as a flagrant breach of the Sino-British agreement, which you talked about. If China doesn't back off, what's the next step? Is there any protocol for what the government for what governments can and should do?
Well,
trade sanctions, the UN.
Just firstly and briefly on that statement, because I think it is really significant. As you say, it's more than 200 parliamentarians from more than 23 countries, and it's non-partisan. It includes Greens and Socialists and Conservatives and Liberals from Germany and the UK and the US and Australia and New Zealand. It is an incredibly diverse group, and it shows that concern for Hong Kong is widespread. My hope is that China will live up to the word that it promised in 1997. We're only 23 years into the transition period. And if it doesn't, it will show that the world cannot trust the Chinese Communist Party's word. If we can't trust them on Hong Kong, what can we trust them on? And there'll be lots of flow-on consequences from that.
China's foreign ministry in Beijing has issued a sharp rebuke. It's accused certain countries of, quote, deliberately using bandit logic and anti-China chaos in Hong Kong as a pawn to split, subvert, infiltrate and destroy China. Given China, Australia, as I say, has made its feelings known. Do you think that's a shot at Australia? And do you think that China will perhaps take similar steps as they have to, well, let's use the word punish Australia, shall we, as they did over Australia's call for a corona inquiry?
It may be a shot at Australia, Fran, but my hope is that China doesn't follow through on any of those threats, because all we are asking them to do is to live up to the legally binding agreement that they reached in 1997. This is an agreement that was lodged with the UN that China voluntarily entered into. All we're saying is live up to the standards you promised that you would.
You're listening to RM Breakfast. Our guest is Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson. James Paterson, your home state, Victoria, is negotiating to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. Do you accept the deal will mean billions of dollars of investment for Victoria, as the Premier said, as Victoria tries to deal with and come out of the job losses caused by the pandemic?
That remains to be seen, Fran, but from the international experience we know that even when the investment dollars do flow, it's not always an unmitigated positive experience for the host country. There are many examples in our region and across the world. Sri Lanka probably the most spectacular and well understood example, where very substandard infrastructure has been built at very high cost, and developing countries in particular have been loaded with enormous amounts of debts that they cannot repay.
Yes, but Victoria's not in that position, is it? It's not a developing country, and it's got high quality building and construction industry.
Yes, well, we also do have a track record of some of our projects running over cost and over time, Fran, and I wouldn't want Victoria to be placed in a situation where it is in any way dependent or beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, as other countries have. But my principal concern is that by Victoria signing on to this, what they've done is handed a propaganda victory to the Chinese Communist Party, who will now be able to go around the Pacific and our region and say, although it's true that the Australian government is not a signatory to BRI, look at the Victorian government as a signatory to BRI. And in doing so, Victoria is actually critically undermining our national security and our national interests.
And if this Victorian Premier has taken a look at that gamble and thought, well, a propaganda victory versus, 10,000 jobs for Victorians, can you understand a Premier making that decision?
No, I can't understand it at all. I think nothing is worth a propaganda victory for the Chinese Communist Party that threatens Australia's national interest and national security. And in any case, this is beyond the expertise and the qualifications and the responsibilities of the Victorian Premier. It is clearly a matter for the federal government. It is clearly entering into foreign relations. So whatever judgment Daniel Andrews arrived at, he should have also arrived at the judgment that it was beyond his pay grade.
James Paterson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Fran.